Have you ever replayed a conversation in your mind long after it ended? Perhaps you wondered whether you sounded intelligent enough. Maybe you regretted a joke that nobody else even remembered. Or perhaps you spent hours worrying that a simple disagreement had permanently changed the way someone saw you. If so, you're not alone. Millions of people live with an invisible audience inside their minds. Before making a decision, they imagine how others might react. Before expressing an opinion, they consider whether it will be accepted. Before setting a boundary, they wonder whether someone will see them as selfish. Over time, this silent habit becomes so automatic that it no longer feels like a choice. It feels like personality. But what if it isn't? What if the voice constantly asking, "What will they think of me?" is not your true voice at all? This question sits at the heart of one of Carl Jung's most profound ideas. Jung believed that many of us spend years building a version of ourselves designed to be accepted rather than understood. We become skilled at adapting, pleasing, achieving, and fitting in. We learn which emotions receive approval and which should remain hidden. We carefully shape ourselves to meet expectations until one day we discover something deeply unsettling. We no longer know where the performance ends and where the real person begins. This is not simply a philosophical problem. It influences almost every area of life. It determines whether you speak honestly in a meeting or remain silent despite knowing you're right. It influences whether you pursue the career that excites you or the one that earns admiration. It affects the relationships you stay in, the opportunities you reject, and the dreams you quietly abandon because someone else might not understand them. Most people believe these choices are rational. In reality, many are driven by a force that operates almost entirely beneath conscious awareness: the need for approval. Psychologists have studied this tendency for decades. We know that human beings naturally seek belonging because, throughout evolution, isolation often meant danger. Being accepted by the group increased the chances of survival. Our brains still carry traces of that ancient programming. Rejection activates many of the same neural pathways associated with physical pain, which is why criticism can sometimes feel surprisingly intense. Yet biology tells only part of the story. If our desire for approval were purely instinctive, we would all experience it in roughly the same way. But we don't. Some people express unpopular opinions without losing sleep. Others replay a single conversation for days. Some recover quickly from criticism, while others begin questioning their entire identity after one negative comment. The difference is rarely found in the event itself. It is found in the story the mind has been telling for years. Carl Jung believed that every person develops what he called the persona. The persona is the face we present to the world. It allows us to function within society, cooperate with others, and navigate social life. There is nothing inherently unhealthy about it. In fact, without a persona, civilization would be impossible. The problem begins when our entire sense of self becomes attached to that social identity. Imagine an actor who spends decades playing the same role. At first, the costume is easy to remove. The performance ends when the curtain falls. But after years of repeating the same character, the line between performance and identity begins to blur. The actor no longer remembers who they were before stepping onto the stage. Many people live exactly this way. The reliable employee, the perfect student, the endlessly supportive friend, the child who never causes problems, the partner who always sacrifices. These roles often earn admiration. They make life easier for everyone around us. But they also raise an uncomfortable question. Who are you when nobody expects anything from you? For many people, that question is surprisingly difficult to answer. Not because they lack a personality, but because they have spent so many years responding to external expectations that they have stopped listening to their own inner voice. This is why the search for approval is so exhausting. You can never truly relax when your self-worth depends on something you cannot control. You cannot control another person's opinion. You cannot control whether someone misunderstands you. You cannot control whether everyone approves of your decisions. And yet, countless people spend their lives trying to achieve exactly that. They become experts at reading facial expressions, interpreting tone of voice, anticipating disappointment, and avoiding conflict. They learn how to make everyone else comfortable while gradually becoming strangers to themselves. The tragedy is that this often looks like success from the outside. People admire them, trust them, depend on them. Yet behind the smile, there is often a quiet fear that if they stopped performing, stopped pleasing, or stopped pretending to have everything under control, they might no longer be worthy of love or respect. If any part of this feels familiar, I want you to keep watching. Because by the end of this video, you will understand where this pattern truly begins, why Carl Jung believed it represents one of the greatest obstacles to becoming yourself, and most importantly, how you can begin reclaiming an identity that is no longer built on the fragile foundation of other people's opinions. To understand why so many intelligent, capable, and compassionate people spend their lives seeking approval, we have to go back to a place that most adults rarely think about: childhood. Because long before we learned how to impress the world, we first learned what we had to do to be loved. The beliefs that shape our adult lives are rarely created in adulthood. More often, they are formed long before we have the words to describe what is happening. Every child enters the world with one fundamental psychological need: to feel safe, accepted, and loved. Food, shelter, and protection are essential for survival, but emotional security is equally important. A child depends entirely on the people raising them, which means the brain quickly begins searching for an answer to one critical question: what must I do to keep their love? If love is given consistently, without being tied to perfect behavior, extraordinary achievements, or emotional suppression, the child gradually develops a stable sense of self. They learn that making mistakes does not make them unworthy. They discover that disagreement does not automatically lead to rejection. They begin to separate who they are from how they perform. But for many people, that is not the lesson they receive. Instead, they learn that acceptance has conditions. Perhaps they were praised only when they succeeded. Perhaps emotions such as anger or sadness were dismissed as weakness. Perhaps expressing a different opinion led to criticism, guilt, or silence. Some grew up with parents who expected perfection. Others learned that keeping the peace was more important than expressing themselves honestly. The specific circumstances differ from one family to another, but the psychological conclusion is often remarkably similar. If I want to be loved, I must become the person other people want me to be. Children never make this decision consciously. It happens quietly, through hundreds of ordinary moments that seem insignificant on their own. A child proudly shows a drawing, only to hear what could have been done better. A teenager shares an opinion and is laughed at instead of being heard. Someone cries after a difficult day and is told they are being dramatic. Someone else receives affection only after bringing home excellent grades. None of these moments necessarily create lasting psychological wounds by themselves, but when they become patterns, the developing mind begins adapting to them. This is one of the most remarkable abilities of the human brain. It adapts. If honesty creates conflict, we become more careful with our words. If vulnerability leads to shame, we stop showing vulnerability. If pleasing others keeps us emotionally safe, pleasing others slowly becomes automatic. At first, these adaptations are incredibly intelligent. They help us survive our environment. The problem is that the brain rarely asks whether those strategies are still necessary 20 years later. Imagine someone who grew up with a parent whose mood changed unpredictably. Some days the parent was warm and affectionate. On other days they were critical, distant, or emotionally unavailable. A child in that situation quickly becomes an expert at observing tiny details. The tone of a voice, a facial expression, the sound of footsteps, the way a door closes. To an outsider, these details seem meaningless. To the child, they are signals that determine whether the day will feel emotionally safe. Years later, that child may become the adult who notices every slight change in another person's mood. They immediately assume they have done something wrong. If a friend replies with a shorter message than usual, anxiety appears. If a colleague seems distracted, they wonder whether they caused it. The pattern feels irrational, but it isn't. It is an old survival strategy operating in a completely different environment. This is why so many adults describe themselves as overthinkers. In many cases, they are not overthinking because they are weak. They are overthinking because their nervous system learned that paying attention to other people's emotions once helped them avoid pain. Carl Jung believed that experiences like these gradually shape the persona. Every adaptation that earns acceptance becomes another layer of the mask we present to the world. We smile when we feel angry. We apologize before expressing our needs. We become agreeable, responsible, dependable, and emotionally available. Not always because these qualities reflect who we are, but because they once protected us. The danger is that repeated adaptation slowly becomes identity. After enough years, people stop saying, "I learned to behave this way." Instead, they begin saying, "This is just who I am." That sentence deserves to be questioned. Because many of the qualities we call personality are, in reality, strategies. Strategies that were brilliant for surviving childhood. Strategies that may now be preventing us from fully living adulthood. This is one of the reasons why change often feels so frightening. When you begin setting boundaries, your conscious mind may understand that they are healthy. Your unconscious mind remembers something entirely different. It remembers that saying no once led to conflict, that expressing anger once threatened connection, that disappointing someone once felt like losing love. The fear you experience today is not always a response to your present circumstances. Very often, it is an echo of your past. Understanding this changes the conversation completely. Instead of asking, "Why am I like this?" you begin asking a far more compassionate question. What happened that taught me to become this way? That single shift is powerful because it replaces self-judgment with curiosity. And according to Carl Jung, genuine psychological transformation always begins with curiosity. Not curiosity about the world, curiosity about yourself. Because until you understand the role your adaptations have played in your life, you will continue confusing survival with identity. And that is precisely where Jung introduces one of his most challenging and misunderstood ideas, the shadow. If the persona explains the version of ourselves that we show to the world, then the shadow explains everything we learn to hide. Few psychological concepts have been as misunderstood as Carl Jung's idea of the shadow. It is often described as the dark side of the personality, leading many people to assume that it refers only to anger, selfishness, aggression, or destructive impulses. Jung meant something far more profound. The shadow is not simply the worst part of you. It is every part of you that your conscious identity refuses to acknowledge. Sometimes those parts are painful emotions. Sometimes they are fears you would rather not admit. But just as often, they are qualities that could transform your life if you allowed yourself to express them. Consider someone who has spent years saying yes to everyone around them. From the outside, they appear generous and selfless. Friends admire their kindness. Colleagues appreciate their reliability. Family members describe them as someone who is always there when needed. But beneath that image lies another reality. Every time they wanted to refuse but agreed anyway. Every time they stayed silent instead of speaking honestly. Every time they accepted disrespect to avoid conflict. A different part of their personality was pushed further into the unconscious. Not because it disappeared, because it was no longer considered acceptable. Their ability to set boundaries became part of the shadow. Their healthy anger became part of the shadow. Their confidence became part of the shadow. Even their ambition could become part of the shadow if, as a child, success attracted criticism or jealousy instead of encouragement. This is one of Jung's most important insights. Human beings do not hide only what is ugly. They also hide what is powerful. Many people spend years trying to eliminate fear without realizing they are also suppressing courage. They suppress anger without recognizing that healthy anger protects dignity. They suppress confidence because someone once called it arrogance. They suppress ambition because they fear being judged as selfish. Slowly, almost invisibly, they begin shrinking themselves until they fit comfortably inside other people's expectations. The tragedy is that this process often receives praise. Society rewards those who are easy to manage. The employee who never questions authority. The friend who never asks for too much. The partner who always compromises. The son or daughter who never disappoints the family. From the outside, these people seem mature, responsible, and emotionally intelligent. Yet, inwardly, they may feel strangely disconnected from themselves. Because emotional intelligence does not mean ignoring your own needs. It means understanding them well enough to express them without being controlled by them. Jung believed that whatever we reject in ourselves does not disappear. Instead, it continues influencing our behavior from the unconscious. This is why people are often confused by their own reactions. Someone explodes with anger after months of remaining calm. Someone suddenly leaves a relationship that seemed perfectly stable. Someone abandons a successful career despite years of working toward it. To others, these decisions appear impulsive. To the unconscious, they are often years in the making. The shadow has finally demanded to be heard. Think about how often people say, "I don't know what came over me." From Jung's perspective, something did not come over them. Something finally came out. The part of themselves they had spent years suppressing had reached its limit. This is why ignoring the shadow is never a long-term solution. Whatever is buried eventually seeks expression. Sometimes through anxiety, sometimes through resentment, sometimes through depression, sometimes through emotional numbness, and sometimes through the painful realization that you have built a life that no longer feels like your own. Jung believed that psychological maturity does not come from becoming a better version of the persona. It comes from integrating the shadow. Integration does not mean acting on every impulse or expressing every emotion without restraint. It means becoming aware of what exists inside you so that your choices become conscious rather than automatic. Imagine standing in front of a piano with half of its keys permanently locked. You could still play music. Perhaps you would even become skilled enough that nobody noticed what was missing. But no matter how talented you became, your music would always remain incomplete. That is what life feels like when significant parts of your personality remain hidden. You may function, you may succeed, you may even be admired. But there is a quiet sense that something essential has never been allowed to exist. This is why Jung described individuation as the central task of psychological development. Not becoming perfect, not becoming admired, not becoming successful, becoming whole. Wholeness requires the courage to face qualities that challenge the identity you have carefully built. The agreeable person must learn that disagreement does not make them unlovable. The perfectionist must discover that mistakes do not erase their worth. The people pleaser must experience that saying no does not automatically destroy relationships. And the person who has spent a lifetime chasing approval must eventually confront one uncomfortable truth. Perhaps the greatest obstacle has never been other people's expectations. Perhaps it has been the fear of discovering who they might become without them. That realization changes the question completely. The goal is no longer to make everyone accept you. The goal becomes learning whether you can accept yourself, even when not everyone else does. Only then does genuine freedom become possible. But there is one final obstacle standing in the way. It is not hidden in childhood. It is not hidden in the unconscious. It is hidden in the ordinary decisions we make every single day without even noticing. And that is where the invisible prison continues to rebuild itself. Once you understand the persona and the shadow, something remarkable begins to happen. You start noticing them everywhere, not only in yourself, but in the people around you. You notice the colleague who agrees with every idea in the meeting, only to complain about it in private. You notice the friend who never expresses disappointment until years of silent resentment suddenly destroy the relationship. You notice the family member who constantly sacrifices for everyone else, yet quietly wonders why nobody seems to appreciate them. And perhaps most importantly, you begin noticing how often you do the very same thing. The prison of other people's opinions is rarely built through dramatic decisions. It is built through thousands of invisible compromises. Every unnecessary apology, every opinion left unspoken, every boundary abandoned, every opportunity rejected because someone might disapprove. No single moment changes your identity, but together they slowly shape the person you become. This is one of the reasons why so many people reach their 30s, 40s, or even 60s with a strange feeling they cannot explain. On paper, life looks successful. They have a stable career. They have responsibilities. Perhaps they have a family. Perhaps they have achieved goals they spent years pursuing. And yet, there is a quiet sense of emptiness. Many people immediately assume they need a different job, a different city, or a different relationship. Sometimes that is true, but often the deeper problem is not that they built the wrong life. It is that they built a life around earning approval instead of expressing themselves. There is a profound difference between those two goals. Approval asks, how do I become acceptable? Authenticity asks, how do I become truthful? Those questions lead to entirely different lives. One produces comfort, the other produces meaning. This is why modern life can make approval seeking even more dangerous than it was in previous generations. For the first time in history, millions of people carry a device in their pocket that allows them to compare themselves with hundreds of others every single day. We compare our appearance, our relationships, our careers, our vacations, our achievements, even our happiness. The comparison happens so frequently that it begins to feel normal. But psychologically, something important is taking place. Every comparison quietly moves the source of self-worth a little further outside ourselves. Instead of asking, am I living according to my values? We begin asking, am I doing as well as everyone else? Those questions may sound similar. They are not. The first leads inward. The second leads outward. And only one of them can ever provide lasting peace. Carl Jung warned that the greatest danger was not becoming influenced by society. That is unavoidable. We all learn from the cultures in which we live. The danger was allowing the collective voice to become louder than our own inner voice. Today, that collective voice has never been louder. It tells us what success should look like, what beauty should look like, what intelligence should sound like. what relationships should become, what milestones should be reached by a certain age. If we are not careful, we begin living according to a script we never consciously chose. One of the clearest examples of this is perfectionism. Perfectionism is often mistaken for ambition, but psychologically they are very different. Ambition is driven by possibility. Perfectionism is driven by fear. The ambitious person accepts mistakes as part of growth. The perfectionist experiences mistakes as threats to identity. That is why perfectionism rarely feels satisfying. Every achievement provides relief instead of fulfillment. The relief lasts only until the next challenge appears. Then the cycle begins again. I have to prove myself. I have to avoid failure. I cannot disappoint them. Notice the language. The focus is almost never on becoming better. It is on becoming acceptable. This is exactly why external validation becomes addictive. Not because praise is inherently harmful, but because it temporarily silences a deeper fear. For a brief moment, the mind finally relaxes. I am enough. But because that belief was borrowed from someone else's approval, it quickly fades. The search begins again. Another achievement, another compliment, another reason to feel worthy. Jung would likely argue that this cycle continues until we realize something profoundly liberating. Self-worth cannot be collected. It cannot be earned once and kept forever. It is cultivated from within through repeated acts of honesty. Every time you express an opinion you genuinely believe, every time you set a healthy boundary, every time you choose integrity over approval, you strengthen something far more valuable than confidence. You strengthen trust in yourself. And once that trust begins to grow, something unexpected happens. Other people's opinions do not suddenly stop mattering. They simply stop deciding who you are. That is the difference between someone who performs confidence and someone who possesses it. One depends on applause. The other depends on alignment between their actions and their values. Perhaps this is why Jung believed that the search for wholeness was never about becoming fearless. It was about becoming so deeply rooted in your own identity that fear no longer had the authority to choose your life for you. That sounds inspiring, but it also raises an uncomfortable question. If approval seeking has shaped our identity for years, perhaps even decades, how do we actually begin changing it? Not in theory, not through positive thinking, but in everyday life. That is where the real work begins. Knowing why you seek approval is important, but understanding the cause is only the beginning. Awareness by itself does not create change. If it did, every person who understood psychology would immediately become emotionally free. Real transformation begins the moment awareness is followed by action. The difficulty is that your mind will resist that action, not because it wants to keep you unhappy, but because it wants to keep you safe. This is one of the greatest misunderstandings about human behavior. We often assume that our brain is designed to make us happy. In reality, its primary goal is survival. If a certain pattern helped you maintain connection, avoid conflict, or receive love in the past, your nervous system will continue repeating that pattern, even if it now creates anxiety, exhaustion, or resentment. That is why change feels so uncomfortable. The discomfort is not evidence that you are moving in the wrong direction. Very often, it is evidence that you are leaving familiar territory. Imagine someone who has spent 20 years apologizing before expressing an opinion. The first time they speak honestly without apologizing, it feels unnatural. Not because honesty is wrong, because the old pattern has been repeated thousands of times. The same is true for setting boundaries. The first boundary often feels like guilt. The second feels like fear. The third feels uncomfortable. Eventually, it begins to feel like self-respect. The emotion changes because the brain slowly learns a new lesson. I can disappoint someone without losing my word. That sentence may sound simple. For many people, it is life-changing. Carl Jung believed that individuation is not a destination, but a lifelong process. You do not wake up one morning completely free from fear, self-doubt, or the influence of other people's opinions. Those experiences remain part of being human. What changes is the relationship you have with them. Instead of asking, "How can I make everyone approve of me?" you begin asking, "Is this decision consistent with the person I want to become?" That shift may seem small. In reality, it changes everything, because it moves the center of your life from the outside to the inside. This does not mean becoming selfish. It does not mean rejecting advice. It does not mean ignoring the people you love. Healthy people listen to feedback. Wise people remain open to learning. Emotionally mature people admit when they are wrong. But none of those things require abandoning yourself. There is a profound difference between changing because you have learned something and changing because you are afraid of being rejected. One is growth. The other is surrender. If there is one idea I hope stays with you after this video, it is this. You were not born believing that your value depended on other people's approval. You learned it. And whatever has been learned can, with patience and awareness, be learned differently. Perhaps you will never completely silence the voice that asks, "What will they think?" Perhaps that is not even the goal. The goal is to make sure another voice becomes stronger. The one that quietly asks, "What do I believe? What kind of person do I want to become? What choice would allow me to respect myself tomorrow?" Those questions rarely produce the easiest life, but they often produce the most meaningful one. Jung once wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Whether those exact words were recorded in that form or not, they beautifully capture the essence of his philosophy. Becoming yourself is not an act of self-improvement. It is an act of self-discovery. It is the gradual removal of everything that was never truly yours. The expectations, the unnecessary guilt, the fear of disappointing everyone, the endless performance. Beneath all of those layers is not a new person waiting to be created. There is a person who has been there from the very beginning. Perhaps quieter than you remember, perhaps buried beneath years of adaptation, but still there, waiting to be heard. If this video helped you see yourself in a different light, consider subscribing to Architecture of Emotions. Every week we explore psychology, philosophy, emotional intelligence, Carl Jung, and the hidden patterns that quietly shape our lives. Not to give you easy answers, but to help you ask better questions. Because the quality of your life is often determined by the quality of the questions you are willing to ask yourself. And before you leave, I'd like you to answer one question in the comments. What is one decision you would make differently if you were no longer afraid of disappointing other people? Take a moment before you answer, because your response may reveal something about the person you have been trying to become and the person you have always been. Thank you for watching. And remember this, the most dangerous prison is not built by other people. It is built the moment you begin believing that your worth must be earned. The day you stop asking the world for permission to be yourself is the day your real life begins.